Vermont frontier, 1887. As settlers rushed to seal their cabins before winter closed in, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Nielsen was still pounding nails well into late September. Neighbors shook their heads. They said he was wasting time. They said he was foolish. Inside his finished cabin, Lars was constructing another one, an 8 by 12-foot wooden enclosure built right inside his living space, with double walls stuffed tightly with sawdust and moss. Instead of the common 10-foot ceiling everyone else favored, he capped his inner structure at just 6 feet 10 inches. While other families wrapped up their cabins in 6 weeks, Lars devoted 4 full months to what looked, at a glance, like a crude shipping crate. Then came March 12, 1888. Without warning, the great blizzard struck. 3 feet of snow fell in just 18 hours. Temperatures crashed to 4 degrees below zero. Winds smashed windows and forced snow through every weakness in standard log walls. Large rooms with lofty ceilings turned into iceboxes, even with stoves roaring. Families slept wrapped in coats, frost creeping across the inside of their walls. Inside Lars's inner cabin, though, the air stayed so warm he calmly wrote in his notebook wearing only a shirt. The thermometers told the story. Outside, 4 degrees. In the main room, 34. Inside the ridiculed inner cabin, a steady 65. What did Lars understand about heat, insulation, and survival that others dismissed as foreign nonsense? If you appreciate stories of hard-earned wisdom that proved itself over time, subscribe. We share more documented accounts worth remembering. Drop your city and time in the comments. We love seeing where these documentaries travel. Before dawn on March 12, 1888, the wind screamed across the Vermont hills. Snow battered the outer walls of Lars Nielsen's cabin with the relentless rhythm of a blizzard that had been building since midnight. Inside what his neighbors mockingly called a wooden shipping crate, the 45-year-old Norwegian sat in shirt sleeves, writing by the glow of a single tallow candle. 3 thermometers hung at carefully chosen points throughout his home, silent witnesses to an experiment months in the making. 1 thermometer dangled outside the main window, its mercury barely visible through frost-coated glass. A second hung 6 feet above the floor in the main room, where most frontier families would crowd around their stoves on a night like this. The third rested inside what Lars called his winter room, the 8 by 12-foot inner cabin, hung at head height above his narrow bunk. He studied each reading with care, recording numbers that would later prove him either brilliant or foolish. Outside, the mercury showed 4 degrees above zero, with gusts shaking shutters like cannon fire. In the main room, where a water bucket had already formed a skin of ice despite banked coals, the temperature held at 34 degrees. Inside the mocked inner cabin, the thermometer stayed fixed at 65, 31 degrees warmer than the main room and over 60 degrees warmer than the killing wind chill ravaging livestock across 3 states. Lars pulled his quilt tighter and heard distant shouts from a neighbor already in trouble somewhere in the storm. He added one last entry to his ledger, snuffed the candle, and settled into warmth that had cost him 4 months of ridicule and the reputation he built over 3 years since leaving Trondheim. The laughter had begun in late August when Lars marked out an 8 by 12-foot rectangle in one corner of his main room, positioned near, but not crowding, the cast iron stove. While neighbors raced to finish before frost, Lars measured, recalculated, and planned a ceiling just high enough to stand, keeping the total volume as small as physics allowed. The math was simple to any man who'd heated a Norwegian farmhouse through a 7-month winter. The outer cabin measured roughly 20 by 28 feet with a 10-foot ceiling, about 5,600 cubic feet of air to warm. His winter room would contain only 672 cubic feet, about 1/8 the volume. Ephraim Cobb, a former soldier who'd crowned himself the authority on frontier building, watched Lars frame inner walls with 2x4s instead of logs and declared it wasteful and unhealthy. "Looks like you're building a rat cage in your parlor," Cobb announced at Mueller's General Store. "If you want warmth, cut more wood like the rest of us." The criticism sharpened when Lars chose his materials. Instead of respectable logs, he used rough boards, creating double walls with a 1-inch gap he packed with sawdust and dry moss, free insulation from any sawmill, but considered fit only for temporary fixes. He tacked a quilt inside the simple plank door as a gasket, raised the floor 6 inches, and filled it with planer shavings and straw. High ceilings were necessary, Cobb insisted, so smoke could rise. Big rooms meant honest houses, tight spaces were unhealthy. His words carried weight. He'd built 3 cabins and helped raise a dozen more. Lars answered quietly when pressed, preferring to let numbers speak. "It's not smoke I worry about," he told the men around the store's checkerboard. "It's how fast the woodpile vanishes." He showed them last winter's ledger, 5 cords burned just to keep the big room barely livable. Heating 1/8 the volume could nearly have that. The idea came from memories of Norway, where farmhouses had small heated rooms and box beds that stayed warm while outer spaces froze. He'd logged winters in Quebec, where a French-Canadian foreman described an uncle's room within a room that saved cords of wood. He'd spoken with Joseph Taco, an Abenaki trapper, who explained how winter wigwams used low roofs and double layers to trap heat in spaces no larger than a closet. None of it mattered to men who trusted methods their fathers and grandfathers had used in Vermont. The settlement watched Lars spend 4 days framing, 3 more packing insulation, working nights by lamplight after field labor. September stretched into October while sensible men declared themselves winter-ready. The final insult came when Lars began what Cobb called foolish experiments, thermometers and measurements. On calm December nights, with temperatures dropping to 10 or 15 degrees, Lars let his stove die to coals, sealed himself into the winter room with a small ember pan and candle, and recorded temperatures hourly. The results filled half a notebook no one wanted to see. The first true test arrived in December when a cold front drove steady winds through every poorly chinked wall. Across the hollow, Lars saw neighbors stoking fires, preparing to sleep wrapped in wool as frost bloomed inside their windows. Cobb's chimney poured smoke. Martha Briggs had a hired man splitting wood by lantern light. Lars ran what he called a controlled experiment. At 6 in the evening, outside read 18 degrees and falling. The big room registered 45 at center, 38 near the floor. Inside the winter room, it held 52. 2 hours later, with outside at 14, the big room dropped to 38. The winter room climbed to 62. By midnight, outside hit 12. The big room sat at 34. The winter room stayed at 60. The math was undeniable. 1/8 the volume stayed 30 degrees warmer using less than 1/10 of the fuel. 5 cords versus 2.5. Days of labor saved. Safety gained. Neighbors dismissed it. Cobb called the thermometers faulty. Health concerns followed. Some claimed it was unhealthy, even immoral, to sleep in such a tight space. Others said it felt un-American. Spacious cabins symbolized conquest of wilderness. Lars's winter room felt like a retreat. By January, woodpiles told a different story. Most families had burned 2 cords. Lars barely touched his reserve. Joseph Taco recognized the design immediately, like a winter wigwam, only built of boards. Traditional wisdom, not madness. Then came March. Mild days and rain lulled settlers into lowering their fires. The storm struck March 11th with historic violence. Temperatures plunged, winds screamed, snow buried cabins. High-ceilinged homes became uninhabitable. At 4 a.m. March 13th, Lars recorded the readings. Outside, 3 degrees. Main room, 33. Winter room, 64. By midday, neighbors' cabins failed despite consuming wood at terrifying rates. Cobb's own cabin showed 54 near the stove, 28 where his children slept. Lars's main room held 36. The winter room stayed at 66. A 31-degree difference separated by a thin wall, proof of how controlled volume and dead air could multiply heat and turn survival from chance into certainty. The forces responsible for the striking temperature gaps followed rules simple enough for any frontier farmer to grasp, if he put aside bias and watched how heat actually moved in enclosed spaces. Warm air naturally rises, and tall ceilings give that heat more room to drift upward and escape before it can settle back down where people live, sleep, and work. A compact room, by contrast, contains far less air to warm and exposes much less wall and ceiling surface through which heat can leak outdoors. The outer log cabin effectively became a shield against wind and snow, acting like a heavy coat that absorbed the storm's violence. The winter room functioned like the shirt and wool sweater beneath, trapping body heat and amplifying the impact of even tiny heat sources. Across the settlement, the human cost of ignoring these principles became painfully clear as families endured indoor temperatures that fell below safe living limits. In one nearby cabin, an infant developed a severe cough after spending the night beside an exterior wall where condensation froze solid, creating conditions that blankets alone could not overcome. Martha Briggs, the elderly widow whose firewood dwindled by the storm's second day, faced temperatures nearing freezing inside her cabin despite frantic attempts to keep a fire going with green wood and furniture that produced smoke but little warmth. Inside Lars's winter room, life continued normally, even as the storm outside unleashed a fury remembered for generations. What neighbors had brushed off as faulty instruments or foreign superstition now marked the difference between rooms where children could sleep safely and spaces where families fought a losing battle against cold seeping into every corner. By the storm's third day, the relentless combination of wind, snow, and bitter cold exposed which building methods truly worked. Standard cabins became little more than rigid tents, while the winter room proved that insulation and controlled space could create a livable refuge no matter how brutal the conditions outside. When dawn broke on March 14th, the settlement faced a reckoning between habits that worked in mild weather and techniques capable of preserving life when winter revealed its full strength. The first plea for help came the evening of March 13th, when Ephraim Cobb appeared at Lars's door, half frozen and desperate, his hat rimmed with ice and his coat stiff with snow from the short walk between cabins. The former soldier, who had mocked the winter room for months, now stood in Lars's main cabin asking whether his wife and children could sleep in the very structure he dismissed as an unlivable wooden crate. Lars paused only long enough to measure the space and calculate survival in human terms. The inner cabin measured 8 by 12 feet, with a built-in bunk taking up 6.5 feet along one wall, a narrow bench for clothing, and hooks holding winter gear. Lars's family of 4 already filled the room to its design limit, but adding Ephraim's wife and 3 children would bring the total to 7 people. That would require about 18 to 20 square feet per person, arranged like the Norwegian box beds of Lars's youth, children sleeping crosswise on the bunk, adults lying along the floor on straw ticks and wool blankets. The setup would feel uncomfortably tight by American standards of space and privacy. Yet European peasant families had endured generations of harsh winters this way, and the added body heat would actually improve the room's efficiency, supplementing the candle and ember pan that served as its only direct heat sources. Lars made the calculation frontier hospitality demanded and opened the winter room to neighbors with nowhere else to go as temperatures plunged toward levels lethal even to healthy adults. Martha Briggs arrived shortly after midnight, guided through the storm by Joseph Taco, who had found her cabin nearly unlivable and her wood supply exhausted. The Abenaki trapper helped settle the widow into the winter room, studying the arrangement with the practiced eye of someone whose people had crowded into small winter lodges long before Europeans entered the forest. The room now held 8 people within 96 square feet, conditions that would have horrified families during ordinary weather, but which meant survival while the storm outside killed livestock in their barns. Lars managed the heating with the care of an engineer tending a boiler. He loaded the main stove just enough to establish a base of warmth, then let it burn down to coals before relying on the smaller heat sources the winter room could safely support. A single coal pan set on bricks provided steady radiant heat, while 2 tallow candles contributed light and roughly the warmth of a small animal. Altogether, the system produced perhaps 200 watts of heat, no more than a modern space heater, but applied to 672 cubic feet of insulated space rather than the 5,600 cubic feet his neighbors were struggling to warm by burning entire trees. The results appeared on the thermometers with laboratory precision, achieved under conditions no university scientist would attempt. Outside temperatures hovered between 3 and 6 degrees above zero, with winds creating effective conditions far below human survival thresholds. The main cabin stayed between 30 and 34 degrees, cold enough for water to freeze and breath to show. Inside the winter room, with 8 bodies contributing heat, the temperature climbed to 70 when everyone was present and settled at 63 by dawn, more than 60 degrees warmer than outside and nearly 30 degrees warmer than the outer room where most families would have tried to endure the storm. At the blizzard's peak, as wind forced snow through cracks unseen in calmer weather, the winter room allowed normal conversation and restful sleep. Children who would have shivered all night in heavy coats slept in everyday clothes. Adults removed outer layers and moved freely without fear of frostbite. During the night, Ephraim Cobb, lying near the inner wall separating the winter room from the main cabin, reached out to touch the boards insulated with sawdust and moss. They felt barely cool, nothing like the outer log walls coated in frost despite fires consuming wood at an unsustainable pace. That physical proof succeeded where numbers and calculations had failed. "How thick did you say these walls were?" Ephraim asked quietly, careful not to wake the children sleeping soundly for the first time in 3 days. Lars explained it plainly: 2 layers of 3/4-inch planks with 1.5 inches of sawdust and moss packed between, plus the same system overhead. The total thickness was under 3 inches, yet the trapped dead air outperformed log walls 3 times as thick. "We fought over inches of ground in the war," Ephraim muttered, settling back down. "Never thought I'd see 1.5 inches of sawdust matter this much." The comment marked more than technical respect. It signaled the beginning of a social shift in how the settlement viewed winter building and fuel use. Martha Briggs, stationed near the door to monitor the main room, remarked that the winter room stayed warmer than her own house ever had during mild weather with a full fire. The comparison exposed how inadequate standard frontier cabins were compared to methods refined over centuries in Northern Europe, and suggested settlers had abandoned valuable knowledge in their rush to build and claim land. By dawn, as the storm weakened, the winter room had proven its ability to preserve life under conditions fatal elsewhere. 8 people survived comfortably using a fraction of the fuel others burned while barely keeping their homes livable. The storm finally broke on March 15, leaving a transformed landscape, snowdrifts up to cabin eaves and some homes buried completely. As settlers dug out from one of the deadliest blizzards in American history, they began counting losses measured not just in property, but in lives. News spread of an infant who had died in a poorly built cabin 3 miles north, where thin walls and bad chinking failed against cold that invaded every space. In the aftermath, as neighbors compared damage and dwindling fuel supplies, differences between construction methods could no longer be ignored or dismissed as foreign oddity. At Muller's General Store, Martha Briggs told anyone who listened that the winter room stayed warmer during the blizzard than her own house ever did on ordinary nights. Ephraim Cobb, swallowing his pride, admitted his family would have been in grave danger without Lars's inner cabin, and that his own large room with its high ceiling was nearly impossible to heat despite burning wood fast enough to exhaust his supply within weeks. These accounts challenged assumptions that had shaped frontier construction since early Massachusetts settlements. Large rooms and high ceilings, once symbols of prosperity and health, revealed themselves as thermal disasters that wasted fuel and endangered lives. Leaky log shells adequate in mild cold became lethal when driven snow and pressure forced icy air through joints unseen in calmer weather. Within months, neighbors began building their own versions of the winter room. Ephraim partitioned off an 8 by 10 foot space around his stove with a lowered ceiling for severe weather. Martha Briggs hired Joseph Taco to help her frame an inner bedroom using the same double-wall, sawdust-filled design that saved lives during the storm. The speed of adoption showed how fast useful knowledge spreads once results overpower cultural resistance. Men who once mocked Lars now studied wall thicknesses, ceiling heights, and insulation materials. The change went beyond curiosity. It reshaped how the settlement balanced comfort, safety, and fuel use, the margins that determine survival. Joseph Taco watched the sudden enthusiasm with quiet satisfaction. Now they build a wigwam inside a house and call it innovation, he told Lars, pointing out that the idea echoed indigenous practices perfected long before iron stoves and glass windows. The comparison revealed that Lars's new idea was really a wooden adaptation of ancient wisdom, working with heat instead of fighting it. As word spread to nearby towns and agricultural journals, the winter room took its place in a longer tradition. Colonial keeping rooms, European box beds, Dutch closet beds, and native winter lodges all relied on the same core principle: small, insulated spaces that conserved heat. The winter room combined these approaches into a design buildable with frontier tools yet superior to conventional log cabins and cast-iron stoves. Modern building science would later formalize the principles Lars applied intuitively: controlled air volume, strong insulation, and reduced thermal loss. The story's deeper legacy lay in how communities judge new ideas. Lars proved that results can overcome prejudice, but often only after crisis exposes the limits of tradition. His eldest son, Caleb Nielsen, carried those lessons forward. When he built his own house years later, he included a low-ceiling winter bedroom and tight inner shell from the start. What began as an emergency adaptation became standard practice. In the end, frontier survival depended not on the biggest cabin or hottest stove, but on how little space a man chose to heat, how tightly he sealed it, and whether he trusted the hard-earned wisdom that said survival meant shrinking your world and thickening your walls when the cold arrived determined to kill.